going to actually defer introductions due to the size of the group and dealing with the call lines. But I do encourage you to introduce yourselves via the chat window. You can click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and send a message. The message will go to everyone by default. So feel free to introduce yourself, share your organization, your affiliation, your contact information. Just to let you know, I'm being assisted here today by Todd Horner, who's going to assist us with agenda item 2, the broadband webpage update. And since I know we're pressed for time, we have a lot to fit in 2 hours. Let's keep things moving and shift gears to the broadband webpage. So you may know SWRPC has published a variety of broadband-related pages over the years, dedicated to the New Hampshire Broadband Mapping and Planning Program, the statewide broadband initiative, our first ever broadband plan, the Mobility Fund Challenge. All those things were kind of overdue in being brought together in one place. We're also looking to kind of reinvigorate our web presence as a resource to the Monadnock Broadband Group in particular. And today we have a draft of this updated and consolidated broadband webpage. And I've asked Todd Horner to give us a brief tour. And yeah, without further ado, take it away, Todd.
All right, happy Cyber Monday, everyone. So this is going to be a quick overview. Basically, the message that we wanted to communicate to the group is that we have started consolidating all of our broadband related content at a single page on the SWRPC website. And that webpage is swrpc.org/broadband. And you can also find the site simply by navigating to swrpc.org, and we've added a broadband tab to the main menu at the top of the page. I'm pointing at it with my cursor right now. So the landing page just gives an overview of what some of the primary activities that the Planning Commission is involved with related to broadband, and it also has a menu that with links to some of our broadband-related content. And again, we'll be adding to this over the coming months. But we do have a page right now that we're using to compile local news related to broadband issues. So it's a good place to go to if for some recent press coverage of broadband issues that are happening around our region. There's the Monadnock Broadband Group webpage. You can visit this page for upcoming meeting information. Like Henry mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so we'll be posting that video up on this page. We also have video from the previous Monadnock Broadband Group meeting that we're also planning on posting online. So folks who missed the meeting still have an opportunity to partake in the presentations and in the information shared. We also have a link up. We'll have to fix that. We're in beta mode at the moment, so there is a link to the broadband plan, which provides some great background on broadband issues in our region and some goals and strategies. Is a great kind of starting point for folks just getting acclimated to the issue. Let's see if okay. And we also have a page that's dedicated to the Mobility Fund Phase 2 challenge process. I'm not going to dive into that at the moment, but just another activity that the Planning Commission was involved with. We'll also be creating a repository of case studies, both as our region gains more experience on broadband implementation and broadband planning. We'll be adding those local examples to this web page. At the moment, it's just it's serving as a repository for resources that already exist online related to case studies in other parts of the state, other parts of New England, and looking even outside of the New England area. And finally, a resources page, broadband related laws and legislation, links to local broadband committee web pages, studies and reports, funding resources and organizations. And like I said, this is a work in progress, and we definitely want to hear from folks in this group regarding what content would you find useful to include on this webpage as a kind of a go-to resource for folks in the Monadnock region who are interested in working on broadband issues. So feel free to suggest those in the chat window, or always feel free to follow up with Henry or I via email or phone after the meeting. But we just wanted to get the message out there that this is a resource that we plan on building and using as a clearinghouse for broadband related information. So I think that does it on the website.
Thank you, Todd. That was perfect. And again, you can, if you have some quick thoughts now, feel free to enter them in the chat or reply to the email I sent with the meeting invite. Any suggestions? So the next 4 items on the agenda are kind of the more substantial ones, and they're split up with a portion of the agenda item with a presentation, and then we'll hold questions until the end of the presentation. We'll do some Q&A with the presenters via the chat, via a phone. So agenda 3, broadband bonding 101. So the background, you know, I think as many of us know, municipal broadband bonding was not a reality until recently. We have one example in the state from Chesterfield who's gone all the way through this process, with many others taking steps and well down that road. But bonding itself is a topic that's outside of maybe the day-to-day realm of many of the volunteer groups working on this issue. So we reached out to Tammy Gelais, who's the executive director of New Hampshire Municipal Bond Bank, and attorney Richard Manley of Locke Lorde to provide an overview of that bonding process, how it relates to this newer topic of broadband. And what I'd like to do is load up their slides and unmute both Tammy and Rick. And we'd like to, again, spend about 20 minutes learning from both Tammy and Rick about municipal bonding for broadband, and then we'll open it up for about 10 minutes of discussion or Q&A and go from there. So without further ado, Tammy St. Gelais, are you there?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for asking me to join you today and for making the necessary accommodations for those of us who don't like to drive in this weather. I've been the executive director been with the bond bank for 19 years now, executive director for 2. I have Rick Manley with us. He's a bond attorney and has been assisting the bond bank for almost 30 years. So I'm going to just talk about what the bond bank provides for services. If you have bonding approved for broadband, I'd like to just go through, we can help you with that. So, and I'll have Rick at the end talk about the legalities of that. Next slide, please. So the bond bank was created in 1977 by the New Hampshire State Legislature under RSA 35A. We're a nonprofit agency and a self-supporting political subdivision of the state. We're operated by a 5-member board of directors appointed by the governor and includes the state treasurer. With our mission, it's to provide adequate markets for the borrowing of money for New Hampshire local governments. We are a full-time staff of 3. We sell our bonds competitively in the national bond market as a pooled bond issue. We typically go out into the market in January and July, depending on participation. So far, we have issued 1,268 in individual loans equaling $2.66 billion to New Hampshire towns, cities, school districts, counties, and various other districts. We've refinanced bonds up to 24 times since 1986, returning over $70 million in savings to participating communities. Actually, we just recently, since I submitted this presentation, we went through another refinancing, $75 million refinancing in bonds, and saved communities over $5 million. So some of those communities don't even know they're getting those savings yet. Our bond ratings, we have high bond ratings. We have a AA+ by S&P Global and a AA2 by Moody's Investor Service. Next slide, please. So by participating in the bond bank's pool, the local government does not have to manage its own public sale of bonds. Instead, the bond bank obtains funds for the community's loan by its own issuance of bonds, typically in January and July. We can assist with short-term financing through bond anticipation notes. If funds are needed prior to our bond sales, we will work with the community to obtain interim financing through a local bank. If your community is planning a project, you can contact us for estimated debt schedules. Because we don't know what our interest rate will be until the day of the sale, we do use conservative estimates, interest rates for budgeting purposes on those schedules. And then we're also available to attend any meetings in your community to talk about how we can help you. Next slide, please. So some of the benefits to communities is that we have very competitive interest rates, and that is due to our being well known in the market and our high credit ratings. There's reduced time requirements because we do a lot of the work for you. There's a low cost of issuance. The bond bank includes the cost of issuance in its bonds, and these fixed costs are shared by others in the pool, therefore reducing the cost paid by each individual borrower. So the only out-of-pocket cost to the municipality is the cost of obtaining your local bond counsel. We provide administrative assistance, and we have a streamlined borrowing process. We take care of the annual disclosure as required by federal regulations. Participants do not need to prepare their own official statement or obtain their own bond ratings or bond insurance. Next slide, please. So the purposes for financing, so all that's allowable is under the RSA 33.3, and I've listed some projects in there, as well as recent broadband infrastructure being included in that. Next slide, please. So planning before the bond sale, you can contact us for estimated debt schedules. I would suggest that you contact your bond counsel to review your warrant article and request a fee quote, so that way they can review your article, make sure that everything is done properly the first time around, especially when it comes to broadband infrastructure. Because this is new, it's really crucial that you contact your bond counsel as soon as possible. We ask that you prepare your cash flow of funds for the project, so you know whenabouts you need these funds, and kind of look at our 2 sale schedules and see which one works for you. Bond counsel fees can be included in the project costs or in your budget, and coordinate your financing needs with our sales schedule, like I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So this is pretty much an outline of our July and our January bond sales. The application deadlines, when the bonds are priced, that's when we would know what our interest rate would be, when you receive your funds, and then when your first interest and first principal payments are due. So basically it's the same timeline, just every year. Next slide, please. So our basic loan requirements are that the bond issue needs to be approved by the governmental entity prior to issuance. A completed bond application is needed, and then we summarize that application and have it approved by our board of directors. An audit is required by a CPA firm, and we look at the last 3 years, as well as an approving opinion from your local bond counsel. So the bond bank sells our bonds competitively as a pooled issue. Interest rates are determined for the participants at the day of the sale. So what I provided you here was the interest rates that we received in our July 2019 bond issue. Interest rates are still low, as you can see. We had a really good turnout. We have our next sale is actually January 8th. So I'd be curious to see how close they come into those all-time low rates. Then final documents are distributed for signatures, and then your bond proceeds are wired into your account on the day of closing. And we do monitoring after our bond sales, so we make sure that you expend your proceeds according to the RSA regulations. We will request your annual audits every year. We want to keep that up to date, so we do look at those and monitor. And then we confirm annually that the purpose of the project that you finance has not changed. So it has not changed from a public purpose to a private purpose, because what we issue is tax exempt bonds in the market. So we want to make sure that we keep that tax exempt status. So we have a team of, next slide please. This is our team of professionals. Most of these professionals have worked with us for close to 30 years. Rick Manley, his firm, he has been with us for almost 30 years. It's crazy to think that, but. And then that's the end of my presentation. So I'm gonna pass it over to Rick so he can talk more about the legalities of broadband infrastructure.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, very good. I'll give it a try. I'm not used to presenting on one of these things, so if I'm doing something incorrectly, please let me know.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, Rick.
Okay, very good. Yep. The thing about broadband that's well, let me back up. The approval of a borrowing for broadband is slightly different, I think, than what folks are used to, for approving at town meetings, the typical infrastructure that you see, schools and roads and, repairing municipal buildings and so forth. And the reason they're just slightly different is because they tend to fall in the category of public-private partnerships, at least those that I've talked to folks about in state about lately. And so RSA 33, as I'm sure talks about a determination that the public benefit to the public outweighs the benefit to the private entity, and that determination then requires just a couple of steps that we don't usually see when we authorize borrowing for the more run-of-the-mill kinds of things that are strictly governmental. I think the primary consideration is, the thing that's different, is that there needs to be a couple of hearings prior to the legislative approval of the borrowing, where folks can sort of hear about what the public benefit is expected to be from a participation with a private party, in this case for broadband. Although this requirement would also pertain to any other kinds of public-private partnerships that one might enter into. Sometimes we see them in the operation and construction of wastewater and water systems and that sort of thing. Other times we see them in the context of certain aspects of airport financing, and they can take lots of different forms. We sometimes also see them in the relationship between communities and private parties that are developing maybe solar panel installations on municipal buildings and that sort of thing. So that they can be kind of all over the place. But here for broadband, is where we see it sharply in focus in New Hampshire. So the thing that's important for folks to understand is that there's sort of a series of legal requirements that flow from RSA 33 3-G, which is, as I'm sure you've seen, is the infrastructure bond finance portion of the Municipal Finance Act. So you've got a requirement for, a 2-month requirement for seeking requests for information, then requests for proposals from private parties, and then at that point an opportunity where these hearings would be held. We think that you probably need at least 2, the way the statute reads, and then a determination by selectmen that the benefit outweighs to the public outweighs the benefit to the private entity, and then that would be followed by the customary vote in town meeting, or in the non-deliberative session in an SB2 community to authorize the borrowing. So it looks like a regular borrowing, with the exception of those particular steps I mentioned for soliciting proposals and then having hearings to make ultimately the making of a determination that the public benefit outweighs the private benefit. I don't think that there's any law on the topic as to how to determine that beyond the selectmen making that judgment after a couple of hearings where the public can have an opportunity for input. So from that perspective, to me anyway, that's the sort of significant difference between the approval of a run-of-the-mill borrowing and one for broadband. It's interesting that for broadband anyway, RSA 33 3-G does provide a little more flexibility with regard to their amortization of principal than RSA 33 otherwise does for normal borrowings. It allows a little more flexibility year to year, and no need to make a first payment of principal for 5 years from the date of issue of the bonds. That can help if you think that you're doing a build out of the system and that revenues may not come in for a little while. There'll still be an obligation to make interest payments, of course, but it might be a way to help shape the repayment of the bonds issued for the financing to match more closely the expectations for when revenues will be derived. An interesting aside on that is that for folks that issue bonds through the bond bank statute allows for even broader flexibility with respect to the repayment of principal in an appropriate case. And so if the 5 years of no principal payments doesn't seem to fit the situation that you encounter, it is possible to have a little more flexibility, as I say, through the utilization of the bond bank. Its own statute does provide a little more flexibility there. But I think the significant consideration for the issuers of broadband bonds, those undertaking projects with private parties, the biggest concern really, I think, arises from the context of the federal tax code as it pertains to tax-exempt bonds. Not every project is eligible for the issuance of tax-exempt bonds, even if the issuer is a local government. And the reason for that is that the federal government is concerned that a private party, and a private party can be a private company, it could also be a nonprofit, gets to somehow with the advantage of tax-exempt financing on a basis that's different from the benefit to the general public. And it's a two-part kind of consideration. Are they getting the benefit of something that's financed with tax-exempt, i.e. More favorable financing, and are they paying something for it? So when you look at the typical structure that we have seen in New Hampshire, we generally don't see a build out of a system that's going to be owned and operated by a municipality. More frequently, we see, and we see it frequently in Massachusetts as well, that the system, there'll be sort of a contribution being made to getting the improvement or the build out off the ground by the municipality, but that the primary user of the infrastructure is going to be a private business running its private business on the bond finance facility. So we have to look very closely at that to see if it really is going to be eligible for tax exempt financing. It's certainly okay to finance it. It could be that it just needs to be done without the benefit of the tax exempt advantage that we would typically expect for a municipality. That's what's happened in Chesterfield. We've certainly seen it in a number of communities in Massachusetts where the contribution really goes to, maybe it's make-ready work, maybe it's building out the whole system, but then turning it over for the operation by a private party. Private party frequently then is making a contribution back to the community to offset the repayment of debt service. That's sort of typically, that's the classic example of something that creates a problem for the issuance of tax exempt debt. The way that these things often get solved is that the community issues tax exempt debt, builds out the system, maintains ownership and control of the system, and then sort of licenses it out to a private party and doesn't get any repayment back. But of course, that doesn't necessarily fly well with voters in the community that say, wait a minute, so we just built this out so that a private company could run its private business, for-profit business on the system. So more often than not, we see the community helping to get the system off the ground, and then a contribution coming back from the private entity that's going to be utilizing the system. And in that event, I think it's typically the case that a community says, well, that's a better business deal for us, and we'll just do that, recognizing that the financing would have to be done on a taxable basis. At the bond bank level, most bond bank issues are tax exempt, and what we have to do is very carefully assess the nature of each of the bonds that's included in one of our bond sales, each of the bonds coming from a municipality, to be sure that it's eligible for tax exempt financing. And so we have to look closely at that and determine whether or not it can be included in our sale if it's going to be financing a project that's involving a private concern, or providing a particular benefit, I should say, to a private concern. So for me, I think what's really important for those that are thinking about financing build out of one of these systems, it's very, very important to talk to your bond counsel about sort of what are the issues that we need to see. Maybe we structure the deal in a slightly different way, which would allow us to do some or maybe all of it tax exempt or not, but just to kind of understand that. At the bond bank board level, I know the board has been very interested in trying to find ways to help folks. And if there are a number of communities that are kind of in this boat, they can issue a pool transaction like the structure that Tammy described just now. That was but done on a taxable basis. So it might be, let's say, a deal that covers half a dozen communities doing broadband work, so that the bonds are taxable, but you'd still get the advantage of a national offering and credit rating increases and all the rest that would pertain to any deal going through the bond bank. But it would just reflect a slightly higher interest rate because it's taxable, and that's probably in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 basis points. Although lately, I think that delta, if you will, is even smaller. I think we just concluded the pricing, as Tammy mentioned, of a refinancing using taxable bonds, and the rates were very, very favorable, at this point anyway. But of course, that's always subject to change. With that, I'd be happy to step back and let anyone raise any questions they might like to about this topic or this aspect of the topic, or wait till the end.
Thank you, Tammy and Richard. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A on either Tammy's presentation or Richard's. Just to give you a quick overview on how to provide questions. If you're joining us via the webinar, you can type a question in group chat. If you introduce yourself, you've already done that. Simply hover over your the bottom bar and type away. I'll read those out in the order they come in. If you're just joining us by phone, you need to unmute yourself. And to do that, hit *6 on your telephone, and you can just kind of interrupt us if you need to. That may be a little tough. If possible, type your questions in the chat if you're joining us via the web. So the first question did come in. It's really yes or no. Is Chesterfield's bond tax exempt?
No, it is a taxable issue. So what the bond bank can do is we can incorporate up to 5% of taxable debt in our tax exempt issue. So we have worked with Chesterfield to do short-term financing with bond anticipation notes. And our January issue is going to be close to 40 million. So we can accommodate Chesterfield's 1.8 million in this sale because we have enough to incorporate 5% in there. So, so we're going to be financing their project in January as a taxable issue under our tax exempt program.
Okay.
I actually have a follow-up question on that. Tammy, how often does the issuance, are you coming up against that 5% ceiling? Is that often been a constraint, or is it usually been the case that the issuance has been well below?
This is my first experience with having a taxable issue in one of our issues, and I've been there 19 years. But I'm going to see this happening more, I think, with these broadband projects. So as long as we can accommodate them in our issues, that's great. But I'm more worried about if there's several communities and we don't have enough room to fit them in our sale. But like Rick mentioned, in that case, we would do a pooled taxable issue.
This is Rebecca. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
So this from Keene and Dublin, just 5% represents about how much? I mean, I think that someone is also asking about whether or not Dublin is looking at tax exempt, and really it depends on on all the questions and answers that we've been talking about as part of this presentation. But 5% represents about how many dollars?
Well, in order to incorporate Chesterfield at 1.8, we needed 38 million, and we have 40 million in this issue.
I mean, I guess the idea is that we never quite know how large a particular bond issue will be until we kind of get there to assemble it.
Right.
Okay. So how about the second question coming in via chat? I understand that Dublin is examining tax exempt structure. Any insight you can share?
I have been speaking with Dublin about their proposed issue. My expectation is it's probably not going to be a tax exempt financing.
The next question, is there an average cost for a community to install broadband? You know, I'll just briefly say, I know I've seen various cost estimates, sometimes based on miles of road, sometimes the number of poles involved. This might not, I don't know that either of you could answer this one, but maybe would welcome someone else on the webinar to jump in.
Because this is new, I'm really only familiar with the Chesterfield at this point, so I wouldn't know about an average cost.
That's really the engineers in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is there anyone waiting on the phone? Oh, one new couple of questions came in. Bear with me while I scroll to these. So if the town continues to own the network in a public-private partnership, with the private entity having a perpetual right to use, does this satisfy the tax exempt?
If the private entity with the right to use is not making any payments to the community for the right to use the infrastructure, then that would be all right. We frequently don't see that, but if that's what folks are doing, that would be permissible on a tax exempt basis, because remember, you need to have kind of a private user and then a payment coming from that user for the use of the bond financed asset.
Okay, great. A couple more questions and just a couple minutes left. So we're aware of at least 4 towns that will be applying for bonds in May of 2020, each with a need of around $2 million. Is that a problem if they are all not taxable?
Well, as Rick had mentioned, we would at that point, with 4 towns, we could look at doing a pooled taxable issue for those communities.
Tammy, is there a minimum that you need to pool do an issue?
I usually don't like to issue unless it's 10 million or more, just because of the costs associated with it. But I think, you know, to satisfy these towns and with the interest rate environment as low as it is, I mean, I would ask Rick's opinion on this, but I think it would still make sense to do that.
Right.
All right, thank you. And thank you to Robert Fish, who's coming up on the agenda later for a little bit of info about costs of building broadband. And those are probably for, I assume, running fiber. Okay, just scrolling through the chat here. Okay, Todd, could you unmute Brad? So Brad, we're trying to work on unmuting you. Could you maybe type in your question or comment while we kind of switch gears here a little bit? So the next item on the agenda, item 4, is about multi-town bonding in New Hampshire. And as of this year, we now have multi-town bonding as an option through SB 103, a bill sponsored by Senator Deach, and it lets, as you guess, multiple communities join together for municipal bonding, as was just described. This, as I understand it, was kind of a minor change to current legislation to make this happen. And I'm kind of want to put either Tammy or Richard on the spot to comment a little bit about how you've seen multi-town bonding work, if you have any comments on how this would apply to a broadband improvement project.
Yeah, I can take a quick shot at that. As you know, it only became effective, I think, in September 10th, I guess it is here. I'm looking at the printout. You know, I think that we need to work with it once or twice to kind of fall into place. But effectively, 2 or more communities would be, authorizing a borrowing, and also approving an agreement under 53A:6, so that it would be clear as to how much of the borrowing would be allocable to each community, and then each community would need to raise its share to do that. It's a little bit unclear to me as I look at the statute if the community would need to authorize the whole borrowing or just their respective share of the borrowing. I don't know that it so much matters, frankly, but I think we just need to kind of clarify that a little bit as we work through the first deal or two. But I think there was already the ability for communities to get together and jointly undertake projects that probably in the past each would have maybe authorized its own bond, and then contributed, however much its share was to a project, and it would kind of go on from there. But this seems to provide a little more flexibility, it seems, by having the mechanic in place just to spell out, how to do this in terms of raising respective shares of the bonds. But I don't know that it's not really a wholesale change to business as usual, really.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I have not yet had a community to work with on this where we actually had to hammer out the agreement. But I think, the agreement, having an agreement in place to allocate costs is something that's been around for a bit.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good introduction. At this point, are there questions or discussion folks would like to have on multi-town bonding? Same as before, please type a question in the group chat. I'll read it out in order, or you can raise your hand via the participants button to be unmuted. If you're on a phone, *6 to unmute yourself. The first question, for public hearings, does the town need to do anything further than noticing the meetings, holding the meetings, making a presentation, and taking a Q&A to meet requirements?
No, I mean, that's basically it for the hearings. You just hold them and folks can come in and say they really like the idea, don't like the idea, whatever. But I think, I think it's intended to inform the ultimate determination by, say, the selectmen as to whether they feel that the public benefit outweighs the private benefit. But, I like a lot of things, it's sort of more of an opportunity for the selectmen to kind of take the temperature of the community to decide what people think about the benefits of the public to the public and to the private entities. But I think at the end of the day, the determination would just be that of the selectmen, so that you wouldn't need the hearing as such, folks at the hearing to be in favor or not of the determination that the public benefit outweighed the private.
Thank you. I think I hear a caller on the line. Would you want to ask your question?
This is Carol Monroe. Can you hear me?
Hi, Carol. We can hear you. Okay.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to comment on the district approach that's been suggested and that the LSR is for. It's a little bit different than the way that Richard Manley described it. I mean, the purpose of this district is to, in essence, create a separate entity beyond the town entity, as a separate municipal type of entity, like a water district or sewer district, that would have control of its own assets and its own liabilities, for that matter. So the ability for a district to accept funding from an organization like the USDA to construct a network, or to, as it experiences success, to be able to go out for bond funding on its own record and not at the expense of the towns.
Yeah, and Carol, sorry to interrupt. We actually want to cover communications districts a little bit later on the agenda after hearing the folks in Vermont about how they're working there. Love to come back to this around agenda item 6 there.
Oh, I apologize. I just heard him talking about multiple town bonding.
Yeah,
that's where that comes into play. So I'll wait.
No, thanks for starting that in. I should have wrote multi-municipality bonding, maybe. So just going back.
I'd say the district approach is a really good one because it makes it a lot easier than having multiple towns authorize debt, for sure.
Great. So I don't see any more questions on multi-town bonding via SB 103. Let's move to our next kind of meatier agenda item, Vermont's innovation in broadband policy. You know, our neighbors in Vermont have recently passed legislation and supported technical assistance programs related to enhancing broadband via this kind of district approach, as well as, you know, kind of hand-holding. You could think about it that way. To learn about those, we're connected, lucky to be connected with Robert Fish, who is a rural broadband technical assistance specialist at the Vermont Department of Public Service, to hear a little bit about the state's broadband innovation grant program and communications union districts, again, in Vermont. Rob, are you still there? Let's make sure we can, we get a hold of Rob and can unmute.
Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Hi, Rob. Yeah, this is Henry. We can hear you.
Hi, Henry.
Just let us know when we can advance a slide for you.
Sure. Well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to share what's happening in Vermont. My name is Rob Fish. I started a month ago as the state's rural broadband technical assistance specialist. So I'm going to share as much as I can. And Carol, I encourage you to chime in when you would like. Like, we are basically following the model that was started with EC Fiber. We'll get to that more in questions and answers, but you can advance. Just first, real quick, since these are the similar challenges you're facing in New Hampshire, don't have much power as the state to regulate telecom. The competition is fierce, and private investment models are focused on the return, which makes it difficult in communities where there's a low population density or the geography and the topography just make things difficult. Next slide. So real quick, in Vermont, I just want to touch on what our statewide goal is. By 2024, we're looking for every business and residential location in the state to have a minimum of 100 down and 100 up. This is a long ways from where we are right now, as you could see from the map there that's showing where 25.3 is available. Next slide. So as I said, that's me in the corner there. I'm one of the key resources now, apparently, from the Department of Public Service. So it's dedicated staff to assist communities. My role is to connect communities to other resources, whether it's people resources, funding resources, or mapping. One of the key things that the state is doing right now is trying to map the broadband availability in the state. This is a challenge since a lot of the providers, the data they provide is covered by non-disclosure agreements. We also have a middle fiber network that new service providers can tap into. Next slide. Ready for that? Okay. So last spring, Act 79 passed, and this did several significant things. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but first it raised additional funds for the connectivity initiative. This funds kind of the last mile effort. What I'm going to focus on, though, are these broadband grants and loans, specifically the Broadband Innovation Grant and the Communications Union District. So next slide. So what is a communication district? Most of you are probably familiar with sewer districts, solid waste districts. These are ways to allow two or more towns to bond together as a municipal entity to build communication infrastructure together. So, next slide. So it's a legal entity to start telecommunications planning. It provides structure and governance, and it insulates individual towns from financial risks. It must be approved. The initial creation must be approved by at least 2 towns at town meeting, whether it's an emergency town meeting or the town meeting in March, and then new towns can join by a select board vote. You can see an example of the first communications union, CV Fiber, which is, I'm sure Carol can tell us a lot more about. Next slide. So why create this? So the first and really one of the most important reasons in in my opinion, is to aggregate demand. When you're a single town trying to get bids from a national telecommunications firm, you don't have much power. You also run the risk of leaving other towns in your region behind if a single carrier, if a carrier can pick off a town one by one. So the towns with the most density, the most population, are likely to get served, while the more rural towns with way more roads and way less people are likely to be left behind. So the CUD is a way to kind of share the benefits. So we're reducing the risks for individual towns and we're sharing the benefits for an entire region. Another reason to create it is that funders are familiar with municipal districts. One of the struggles with Central Vermont Fiber getting off the ground is there's towns working together under, it was an entity that wasn't well known. In 2015, I believe, or 2016, they became the first communication union district. So when you're operating as a multi-town district, you have more aggregate, you have more access to funding opportunities. There's also efficiency. When it comes to laying fiber, it's town boundaries in many ways are irrelevant. Like roads cross between towns, the existing infrastructure crosses, topography divides some towns where you can't get here from there. This is a way to actually plan as a region. I mentioned the risk mitigation. In Vermont, towns currently are not able to use general funds. They're not able to use the grand list to fund broadband. The other major reason is we don't want people to reinvent the wheel. There are models out there, many different models for how a town can expand broadband. And we want to share this within the towns that are in a CUD, as well as within different CUDs that are forming around the state. Next slide. So a lot of people ask how many towns should be in a CUD. Only 2 towns are required to start, but how to determine the boundaries, there's a lot of different thinking out there, but the real question is, what is the critical mass? How are you going to find enough people, enough area, enough subscribers to have the negotiating power and to have the take rate that's necessary to make it possible, to make it businessly feasible? So you should consider the geography, and also just how many people you want sitting around a table to discuss these things. Like that's a challenge, and that's different for different regions depending on how used to the different towns are used to working together. Next slide. So there's no cost to taxpayers with creating a CUD, and if it goes belly up, they're liable to seizure, but the individual taxpayers in each individual town aren't on the hook. Next slide. So this is in Vermont, in order to become a CUD, we're encouraging towns to add something to the ballot, the 2020 ballot. And then once 2 towns are a member of that, additional towns can join by a select board vote. Next. So here's sample language. I'm not going to read this. This may be different in New Hampshire. Next. So the other thing that that legislation that passed did was create the Broadband Innovation Grant. We just finished our first round and awarded 3 grants. I'll go over who got them in a bit. There's going to be 3 different rounds. So we said the first round, the next round is in February, which is going to focus on utilities. And then in April, after town meeting, there's going to be another much larger round for different communication districts or towns that are figuring out different innovative ways to go forward. So you can go to the next one. So what the grant does is it funds a feasibility study. And then if that feasibility study turns up that this is possible, this is something that should go forward, it will fund business planning. And the idea of the grant is to fund just a diversity of solutions. There's not one size fits all. We need creativity if we're going to achieve universal broadband in the state. Next. So this is breaking it down, the different sides of feasibility and business planning. You can go to the next slide. So as I said, we just finished our first round and we approved 3 different grants of 3 different models, really. We approved Central Vermont Fiber, which it's modeling directly out of sorry, which is they've already formed a communication union district. It's 17 member municipalities. We have the town of Newbury is doing a ready district, which is an entirely different model. And then Wyndham Regional Commission is trying to do fiber to the premise and looking at creating a CUD that possibly contain all 27 of their member towns. So next. So any questions? Like, I just wanted to give a broad overview and save most of the time for the Q&A. And Carol, I encourage you to participate in this. You've been doing this way longer than I have.
Thank you, Rob, for the presentation, leaving a good chunk of time for Q&A. Just again, another reminder, encourage you to add questions in the group chat. I see a number of those already. And use the participants tab at the bottom to raise your hand if you want to be unmuted if you're verbally. So of the questions coming in the chat already, Rob, could you please expand on the risk to individual towns if the project goes belly up in a communications union district versus an individual municipal bond?
So I encourage the folks that were from the bond bank to chime in on this, as well as on Carol too.
Sure. So because the communication union district is a separate entity, and it is not that the towns have a delegate to the board of that entity, but they don't, as a group, make their decisions on a town basis. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but the fact of the matter is that when there are bonds, the revenue is pledged, revenue and assets are pledged for those bonds. The revenue and assets that belong to the district are pledged. And so should it happen that they go belly up, that's what has been pledged, is the revenue and the assets from that district. And none of that belongs to a specific town. It belongs to the communication union district. So in that aspect of things, the towns don't have a liability. The towns individually don't have a liability for those assets. It's well known that should there be issues or should there be concerns, and you have that fiber up on the poles, and it is running a district, that if that were to occur, there would be other partners and buyers out there to keep that district up and running, to keep that broadband up and running.
So then to Tammy, in New Hampshire, if an individual municipality goes through the bonding process and ends up with a taxable bond like Chesterfield and potentially Dublin, and the project fails, what happens in that case versus in Vermont in a district?
If I'm not mistaken, those are general obligation bonds.
That's correct. So they'd still be on the hook to pay for it with or without revenues derived from the operation of the system.
Okay, thank you to everyone who chimed in on that question. The second question, is there ownership requirements for assessor for the broadband innovation grant? First, maybe for assessing the.
There are not ownership requirements, whether it's a municipality, a communication union district, or a business that's working with a town. They can apply for this grant. The grant is just for determining the feasibility and possibly business planning.
Okay, thank you, Rob. There's another question on the Broadband Innovation Grant Program. How far do you expect the $700,000 to go in Vermont? How many communities?
That's really up in the air. There's funding for 3 rounds at this point. The grants are up to $60,000. It doesn't mean that they have to be $60,000 each. And we're gonna try to stretch it as far as we can. Like, this is really an experiment.
Okay, so time will tell.
Yes.
A question for our side of the pond. Rob, you probably don't have the answer to this. Is there funding available for feasibility studies here in New Hampshire? I can say I don't know that there is state funding. Individual municipalities have taken on funding, feasibility studies, and engineering. But is there someone else who could chime in on that?
Well, I do encourage you to meet with your local USDA office. They have various different grant programs that aren't specific to broadband, but could have funding there that would be used for broadband expansion.
In
I would
addition
also
to
look at
that,
Northern Borders.
yeah.
Carol, were you going to add something?
Yes, I was trying to figure out whether I'm muted or not muted. Sorry.
You're still on.
In addition to, I was going to suggest Northern Borders, and there are a number of other organizations, and ValleyNet, which is an Upper Valley company actually, has a grant to do feasibility studies for two areas of New Hampshire. The first one is Carroll County Broadband, which is a group, an up-and-coming group that's been very strong in their desire to see this done, and is doing a lot of work to that effect. And so we'll do feasibility for that group. And then the second is we have some funding to do some work with Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Region Planning. We haven't determined what that will look like just yet, but we will be doing some work with that. These are rural community development grants from the USDA. It's a partnership with the Center for Rural Innovation and with CTG Energy and Technology out of Maryland. And so there are 2 areas here, 2 areas in Vermont, and then 1 in Arkansas and 1 in Western Maryland. But we'll be sharing resources and sharing knowledge across all of those to come up with some, some models, so to speak. And so that money has already been allocated, and we started to do that work. And so there is funding out there. The USDA has a lot of different programs that could fund it, and I know that the North Country Council has access to some funding, and Northern Borders, I think it's called, also has access for some funding for feasibility and planning.
Great,
but no, I don't think the state has allocated any funding.
Thank you to everyone who chimed in with those options. Another 2-part question. Will 700,000 meet the anticipated need? Do you expect another state appropriation to support the Broadband Innovation Grant, or is it too soon to say?
I think it's too soon to say at this point.
Understandable. I think that's covered the questions in the chat. Is there anyone waiting on the line to ask one by phone? Remember, *6 to unmute yourself by phone. Okay. Great job, Robert. Thank you. And I believe, so you have Robert's contact info there if other questions come up. The next agenda item is kind of builds on what Rob was talking about, communications districts. That's something they have in Vermont right now, but we do not in New Hampshire. In the upcoming legislative session here, though, Senator Gene Deach has initiated a legislative service request and draft legislation that would create these districts, similar, as I understand it, to those created for other utilities, water, sewer. I'd like to ask if Senator Deach could provide an overview of the status of how that's going. If there's time, others could chime in as well.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Senator Deach. Thank you.
Okay, microphone is at a good level, I take it.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so this is Legislative Service Request 2028-11. And I just submitted the revised version today. We should have a completed draft of that from the Legislative Service offices by the end of the week. And so we will be people will be able to actually go online and see that. But I have put up, now I can't scroll this, but I don't seem to have control over it. If you let me share my screen, then I could do that, or you can just scroll up for me. Let's see. I don't see anything here that lets me scroll.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, so it's very similar. If you scroll up to page 6, I think is probably what we're going to want to look at. It's very similar to what was just described as far as what's, there we go, we passed it. Okay, so it's page 5, yeah. There we go, where we start with Roman numeral 1. Down a little bit. I'm looking for it. There we go. So this is what the agreement would actually incorporate. But it's the same basic structure as in Vermont. There are a few little twists that are different. Once the district is created, it requires an actual town meeting for another town to join rather than just the select board agreeing to join. So there's some little differences, but basically it's very similar to the Vermont statute, but based on the New Hampshire sewer district concept. The difference with the sewer district, however, is that these are, it can only be funded by revenue bonds, and that happens once the business is going. So what I'm not sure was clear in the description of the Vermont bonds is that once the district is created, where you've done the study and you've decided that it's a good idea and that you may have some plans to move forward, then you can fund that privately, you can look for grants, you can look for all kinds of ways to get your startup started. I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm going to put it in terms of startups. But you cannot do it through tax monies. So once your entity is started, you've got revenues flowing in, and you have a good business plan moving forward that shows you're going to at least be revenue neutral for X number of years, then you go out to the bond bank. And that's the point at which you can be on the open market. And that is why people will be willing to invest in this bond, because they can see that it has a good business plan. So really you're in a situation that's more like a business entity, perhaps, than like a typical, so it's a revenue bond rather than another sort of taxpayer guaranteed bond. So what we see here is a description of the what's in the agreement. You can run down the list easily and see is looking at equipment and so forth. And then it will talk about, that's good, talk about the level of participation of the communities and where that might be cited and so forth. I think one thing that we're looking at here in New Hampshire that also might be different than Vermont is because we have a certain amount of existing infrastructure, and in a town like Peterborough, for instance, the major infrastructure is in the X and Y axis of the town, 101 and 202. And then the 4 quadrants, the further out you get, the less coverage communication that you have. it could be possible that Peterborough might actually want to share in multiple communication districts. They might share with one on the northeast side and a different one on the southeast side, because they would be associated with other towns who maybe don't have even a major cross, who would be looking to start a communications district. Otherwise, it's very difficult for Peterborough to attract anyone to serve those quadrants. So I think that is one aspect of the communications districts that hasn't been mentioned so far. Carol, did you have anything else that we might want to add that we put in that was different? Now, I worked on this with Carol Monroe and also with Margaret Burns from New Hampshire Municipal.
So the objective is to create a separate municipal entity, as we've talked about before, with its own assets and liabilities. And when it would come time for bonding, it would be on its own basis. And they would be probably revenue bonds, not general obligation bonds of a town. In so doing, then it creates the responsibility is with a district similar to, in New Hampshire, similar to a sewer district or a water district, in making those decisions. And the assets belong to a district, not to any one individual town. So if a town were to leave the district, they wouldn't be taking their assets with them. They don't belong to them. And all decisions and all policies regarding the district are made for the district at the district level. And so, just for an example, EC Fiber in Vermont is coming up to a point where all their unserved areas will be served, and in about 3 years they'll have excess revenue. Nice to have, isn't it? But they'll have to decide as a district what to do at that point, whether to lower their rates, whether to fund low-income households. But the decision won't be made one town at a time. It will be made for the entire district. So one town can't take their excess revenue and another town can fund, low income. It doesn't work that way. These are decisions and policies made at the district level. In the same way, where to build and where to build next are all decisions made at the district level, usually based on take rates and need. But those are all district decisions. And so that district board would be making those decisions. The representatives to that board would be reporting back to their town. And the budget for the district is actually reviewed by each town for comment and questions prior to it being voted on every year.
Thank you, Jean and Carol, for the overview of those districts. I'll just want to quickly point out we have uploaded a copy of the draft language to the chat. You can download a copy to your computer right now if you wish. And we have about 10 minutes for some questions and discussion on this. One question I'll start out with is based on a comment from Rob Fish in the chat. He pointed out that in Vermont, there is no prohibition from Vermont, communications union districts going across state boundaries. And it would be interesting to know if that's a feature of the districts in New Hampshire to go across into Vermont, Massachusetts.
I don't believe we have covered this. It's probably a good thing to add. And at this point, we're early in, we still have the option for amendment. So I will definitely keep that in mind. That's a good addition to this. I'm looking at other questions here.
Yeah, feel
Let's see,
free.
chances for success. We have great chances for success. As Carol mentioned, Carroll County, which just so happens to be named that, and that's Jeb Bradley's district, is very interested in working with this. And so this will be a bipartisan bill. And we have a lot of support from all the rural communities. So I think we have a strong likelihood of success with this bill. Then I see Brad is asking, SB 170 only allows for bonding for the underserved. I would just mention for that, as you probably know, Brad, we've got our congressional folks working on changing the definition of underserved, and maybe Carol Miller might have an update on that, I don't know. But we were more looking. And then also, is Jay Kahn on the line? Jay Kahn is putting in a bill which changes the definition of underserved. So that has to do with if a company does not respond to RFPs, then that area for which the RFP was set forth is considered unserved.
Thank you for diving into those. And if either Jay or anyone else was looking to chime in and you're just called in, remember *6 to unmute yourself.
Let's see.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, this is Brad. So I'm getting back to the question that I asked there about bonding for underserved, because just changing the definition of underserved does not get rid of the problem. The problem is, depending on the cut of how many people in a town are underserved versus served, makes a big difference in the financial ability to bond and put together a program. To change the SB 170 wording so you can bond for all improvements in broadband, not only to underserved and not only just to underserved, will be a big benefit, giving towns flexibility. Just changing the definition of underserved to some other definition is still going to put towns in this quandary of how do they address the issue of served versus underserved and doing the funding and the financial arrangements.
And I would agree with that, of course, Brad. And that's what I was mentioning in the case of Peterborough, because we have these quadrants. We might be using them in communications districts with surrounding towns. The reason that we're not pushing for an amendment, I mean, we could put one in, but we don't think it would pass.
On the other hand, part of what happens when you form a district is you decide where you're going to build and perhaps where you're not going to build. So it doesn't mean that because you have a district of 19 towns or 7 towns that you'll build 100% to every location, particularly where you have extreme cable access through the centers of town or in more congested towns in the district than in others. And so I'm not advocating to overbuild cable unless you need to do that to get to the other side of town to build out the unserved. And I think that having a district allows you to do that. And as Jean was saying, you could have Peterborough could join a district, and it could join the district so that those areas that are unserved, which are close to another town that's unserved, could in fact then be covered. So that's the objective.
The bill talks about municipalities. We're saying towns, but it's actually, it does include cities. It's municipalities.
Yeah.
Okay, but basically it sounds like there's no initiative at all to change the wording away from underserved only.
We could
Not
put
in
in the
this
bill, Brad, but you've got all the telecoms would be fighting it.
But there's no need to do that in this bill.
No,
you can
not in
create
this
a
bill.
district. And
No,
I'm
not
not
in the
talking about that bill
communications
specifically.
bill.
I'm talking about the SB 170, but it could also affect that bill also.
right.
I think we had it there, at the beginning, and that was what we were able to pass, is what it was whittled down to. And in fact, the original, I believe if you look at the original bill, which Jay submitted about 2 years before, that was more like what you would like to see, Brad, but I doubt that we could get it passed in the legislature, and I'm almost positive the governor would not sign it.
Well, the current providers may have changed their attitude now when they realize that towns really are not interested in setting up their own, running their own ISPs. And their preference is to work with the current providers. I know Consolidated is they're very happy about working with us, and that's a nice business model for them. I think other providers around the state will embrace us when they start realizing it's not competition to them, it's actually augmenting a way of rolling out to these underserved communities.
Well, I would be happy to submit it, and I think that's what Jay is trying to address a little bit by Comcast is not able to even be as flexible as CSI's been, or CCI's been. And I know that for that reason, they are not even responding to RFPs, though I've been told that they may begin to do so.
Jean, this is Rebecca. In regards to the cities versus towns, I just need to make it clear that Keene is very supportive of everything that's going on. We're really happy that the state as a whole is working on improving broadband, but nothing to date has happened that helps communities that don't meet that definition of underserved or unserved. So I still have a big problem that we have colleges and businesses and other employers in the region saying, how do we solve this problem? Because we might meet that definition of served, but we have terrible service and no competition. And so I just wanted to point that out, that like Brad, I'm interested in getting beyond Senate Bill 170 and seeing what more we can do.
And I can, we may have one day in January we can put in new bills, and I can try for that. I guess it doesn't hurt to keep pounding on the wall, even if you know you're not gonna break it down.
Thanks everyone for the discussion so far. I see there is a question about the idea that a new definition might come to us eventually about, you know, what's the threshold for served and underserved. Perhaps that could be tackled under the updates section of the agenda. If, for example, there's someone from our federal delegation attending. Just going down the list, I see a question. It could be interpreted as a yes or no. Do water or sewer districts differentiate between served or unserved? I think that is pointing out maybe that distinction isn't part of the district legislation at all, if that's making sense.
Hi, folks. It's Jay. I've heard about the last 5 minutes. I read your email, Henry, while I was in a meeting, and I saw the meeting was canceled, and then I didn't look beyond. I was reading on my cell phone, I guess. Anyway.
Thank you for joining, Jay.
Yeah, sort of. You're right about the federal delegation. I've talked with them about a few things that they should be targeting, and that's one of them. The definition of unserved really hasn't moved since, I believe it was set in 13 or 14. But anyway, I think that's a good, I talked with Hassan's staff about that. She's got a bill that is focusing specifically on financing. I think there's some financing issues too that we're going to start to run up against the New Hampshire municipal loan cap. Maybe not this year, but we could this year and we could again next year. And that would be because these are always going to be taxable bonds, so long as there's the private benefit. And there's a cap on that that's pretty tight. The other thing I can add to what I heard in the conversation is Comcast is going to submit on Hancock, and it'll be interesting to hear from Hancock what that's about. I've been really underwhelmed by what they, they were very key in helping put together the legislation in Senate Bill 170, and they just have been non-responsive in any of the RFPs until Hancock.
That's an interesting update, and we're kind of transitioning to updates now.
Before you go to updates, can I make one more comment on underserved?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the problems with the definition of underserved, it says what the download rate is. It says nothing about data caps. So we have plenty of services say they provide adequate service, but the data cap means after 1 week, they no longer provide the data rate required. So to me, if they can't provide the entire data rate for the entire period of service, in other words, no throttling, no capping, then they are basically not providing the service.
Brad, that's a really good point. So I'll tell you, I'll be happy to work with you on putting that amendment together for January, and I would focus on that piece of it. I think that's one we may be able to really make hay with. So I'd be happy to work with you on that.
So Gene, I don't think you've seen the bill I'm doing, but the nature of it is when we get to the RFI process and before we get to the RFP process, if a vendor fails to reply to the RFI, a current provider fails to reply to the RFI, they are considered providing service.
Yes, I already mentioned that to everybody and told them that you had that in progress.
Maybe we can attach this idea to that.
That's possible, or if we think this might get a little more controversy than yours, then we might just put it in January.
Okay.
Maybe a final question for Agenda 6 would there be any interest or willingness to put the bill forward this session on an appropriation in New Hampshire to fund municipal broadband feasibility studies like in Vermont through their Broadband Innovation Grant Program?
My silence reflects a no.
Okay. Any others want to chime in?
I would just say that part of that definition issue that we described earlier, and as I say, I haven't checked with the congressional delegations on how that's proceeding, but the ag grants were limited to the old definition of broadband, which I can't even remember what it was. It was so ridiculous. What it was.
10 and 1.
It was what?
10 and 1.
10 and 1. Yeah. So we were trying to get those grants increased. So the definition there is 25.3. And that would open up those grants to a lot more places. Mm-hmm. So we'd have the ag grants and I see, oh, you're saying CDFA wants to, but they don't have any money. Okay. Again, Yeah, I could see Ruth is saying no too. I think the issue is that we are in the process of losing some of our revenues, expected revenues. It's being niggled away in little pieces, and unless revenues come in at significantly higher, we're probably going to end up being cutting rather than adding on in this non-budget year.
Thank you, everyone, for that feedback. Let's switch to agenda item 7, which is updates. And this might be challenging, but I was hoping we could do this in around 10 minutes, goal of trying to wrap up towards around 4. And the goal here is to learn what others are up to. We've heard quite a bit already, but a number of people haven't heard from yet. I'm sure there's a lot going on to report from. Encourage you to, as commenting or asking questions before, utilize the chat. I'll kind of provide some verbal updates from what I see. You can raise your hand to be unmuted. Todd will take care of that for us. Or if you're just calling in *6 to provide a verbal update about what you're working on. Who wants to start us off?
Well, you want to update on where Chesterfield is in the installation process?
Great, thanks, Brad.
Okay, so as you know, we had the whole agreement to go through here. Consolidated started installing fiber July 1st. They basically have the entire structure of fiber and splitters and everything else up in town right now. They're hooking up residents. And so we're basically at the phase where, the last part of the phase where we're just hooking up residents at this point in time. So we're over 50% done.
That's terrific.
So this is Carol Monroe for the Dublin Broadband Committee, unless Rebecca wants to do this. Basically, we're working with CCI to move forward with a bond offering and town meeting approval in March, and then to build out the entire town of Dublin, including those residents or premises that are being fed or served from either Peterborough, Jaffrey, or Marlborough. It was the most cost-effective and least risk of the options that we had, and we decided to move forward with that. On the other hand, I would like to say, so people know, that we had 4 or 5 responses to our RFP, and there are some companies out there who are really looking forward to doing business here in New Hampshire, and they had some very interesting scenarios and options to do that. And so even if CCI is not the answer for some towns, there are other options, and I think that we need to keep those, keep this process moving along, because I think we will end up with some other vendors in the state.
Carol, can you share those via SWRP?
Sure. It's public because they responded to a public RFP. So one of them is Matrix Communications out of New Jersey. They were actually instrumental in the early days of EC Fiber in terms of design and construction. And so they're familiar with that model. They have been responding to RFPs across New Hampshire, as well as to towns in Vermont who are looking to build out fiber to the premise. So they're doing it in Massachusetts in one community. I think they have another one lined up in Vermont, and it's either Vermont or Massachusetts. And so they continue to move that forward. The other is GWI, which is a ISP out of Maine. They've been working a lot with the Maine Coalition and Maine Broadband, extending what was built with the ARRA funds in 2010 to communities, building out the last mile. They're the operator in most cases, so sometimes they do construction, design, and management and operations, and other times it's just the operator. So they've restructured their organization, and they have funding now to move across northern New England. And so they're looking for opportunities in New Hampshire and in Vermont, and they're looking, they really prefer to work with a district, not just one town at a time. The third group is where you have some Argent Communications, which is a cable company in some of New Hampshire. They have a fiber broadband company as well, Eustace Communications, and they submitted it as a partnership between the two of them. And so they're looking to determine how they can use their pole access that they have for cable to extend fiber to the premise. And so they'll be responding to, they responded to ours, or we'll be responding to others in New Hampshire as well. And the last, of course, is Y Valley. And their proposal was a little bit on the light side, I think, because they really are a firm believer in wireless being the solution, which may or may not be the case. And in most cases, you know, the wireless has to be backed up somewhat by fiber to the access points. And so that was the third option. They're doing quite a lot of wireless to towns in Massachusetts at the moment. That's a summary of those.
Thank you for the updates. And I
Can I
think
ask a question, Henry? Has anyone heard about FirstNet and AT&T?
To be honest with you, the only thing I've ever heard is that where they're putting up more cellular, they don't have any desire or impetus to be specifically providing AT&T access to the rural areas for regular broadband and you know, and access outside of the emergency systems. I just haven't heard them talk about how that's going to extend rural broadband.
We'll keep asking.
any other updates from around the region? I think there's some folks from outside of the region and other parts of the state. There's one
Can you hear me?
question. Yes, go ahead. We can hear you.
Yeah, hi, Doug Norman from Harrisville. We just issued our RFP on the 27th of November. There were 5 companies that were interested in answering our RFP and providing a proposal, and those were pretty similar to Dublin's. Matrix, TDS, that's I think a new one here, CCI, Y Valley, and Argent Communications. That's pretty much it for us.
Thanks for the update, Doug. I know there's some activity we heard about in Hancock, Westmoreland, Walpole. These are some that are coming to my mind. Are there folks from those communities that have anything to share?
This is Dana Primiano. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dana.
Yes. Okay. So from Hancock, just a brief comment in connection with the response from Comcast, as it was mentioned earlier, that they did respond to our RFP, and you know, we're in the process of assimilating that response in detail and working with the select board and the broadband committee to understand its details and implications. So you know, we I guess don't want to get into it much further here at this stage, but you know, they did respond with a price and a proposal, which we'll be evaluating here over the next evaluating further over the next week or so.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear your response. If you could get something back to Henry that might be posted to the group, that could be helpful. Just that their desire to own infrastructure as opposed to share it is, you know, something to see if they've moved from that position.
Right. There is a little movement there. Clearly, they state their preference is to own it, as you suggest. But there is another option there that may be possible. But you know, we'll flesh that out a little further, and we'll try to get an update out to folks in, you know, fairly short order.
Thank you for the update, Dana. And I see one comment here, interest in having the RFP, RFI responses and content shared. That's something that the Planning Commission is in a position to do via our webpage. And we would, you know, invite the municipalities that can obtain permission, you know, for those things to be shared, to send those to us to get approval. And we can think about how that all looks. So it's something to keep in mind. There are a couple of other updates showing up in the chat. Westmoreland is in the process of, I guess, negotiating or in discussions with CCI, Consolidated Communications, on a response to that town's RFP. The town of Temple is working through the request for information process. There's one question, not an update, that's related to poll rights and challenges. If anyone, the question is, can anyone comment on poll rights challenges and how that's being handled in the RFP process? Appreciate response in the chat to that. If you'd like to provide a verbal response, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself, or use the participants button at the bottom to raise your hand and we will unmute you.
Rebecca from Keene here. I have a little bit of experience working with the pole owners in the city for our own independent fiber projects, and also have worked with the PUC and with previously Fairpoint, Verizon, and PSNH. So I have a little bit of history there. I would just say that CCI's ownership of the poles and the current infrastructure on the poles gives them quite an advantage when it comes to providing solutions and the total cost of those solutions in the current environment.
Thanks.
Hi, Henry, Tim Murphy here. Hi, everybody. I'm wondering, and this could be a segue into the next agenda item, but if that question that's just been posed is a good topic for upcoming meeting of this Monadnock Broadband Group.
Yeah, I think we're there. I guess my follow-up question to Christine's question is who's coming up, or where the challenges being experienced, and who might we need to talk to have a featured agenda item.
So again, if the group feels that this is a worthwhile topic, we can make the rounds and try to determine who is, you know, who could speak effectively to the topic, and then try to get someone on a future agenda. But I think the starting point is, do others have interest in this? And again, I don't mean to move us to the next agenda item, but agenda item 8A is essentially intended to be a brainstorming of what is it that the members of this Monadnock Broadband Group feel would be helpful to have on future agendas of the group, assuming we want to continue meeting.
Rebecca here again. I would like to reiterate that we need to continue to look at what the state can do and what we can do legislatively, and how we can update the legislation to change that definition of unserved and underserved. But I think we also need to look at opportunities outside of bonding, how we can bring more funding to New Hampshire for broadband development projects. Maybe how can we establish partnerships with organizations that already have a lot of infrastructure in the state? If there's a way to work with the CCIs and what's the organization? First Light and the former Network New Hampshire Now project, who have a lot of infrastructure in the state. What do those opportunities look like? And then what are perhaps grant or funding opportunities that do not depend on Senate Bill 170?
Great, thank you for the suggestion. And I would just say we'll kind of keep this, a real brainstorming session. I encourage people to actually type their responses in and get some of those ideas out. It's a little bit tricky to keep up with the unmuting and raising hands, so I apologize if we're not getting to you. And I encourage you to type things in. But some things that have come up, finding out about the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission's rulemaking process related to Make Ready, that deals with pole attachments for infrastructure. An update from FirstNet. This group had or hosted FirstNet for a presentation a while back. I'm sure there are updates to report from their end. Okay, are there, I'm not seeing any new items for a future meeting. One thing we can do is also just put out the question after this meeting to solicit more input on that. We'll need help in identifying those presenters. We'll appreciate that in advance. I think that's a good next step there. The next item is about the meeting schedule for this group. And, one point to make there is that the schedule's going to be tied somewhat to the availability of, folks like FirstNet and others who would present. But at least from the Planning Commission's perspective, we want to make ourselves available to get the group together more often than has been in the past, say every other month or so. And our intent would be to reach out to the group to find a good meeting time after we've cleared schedules with the presenters. So, and appreciate these other responses about agenda topics coming in.
Yeah, I would say that sometime late in January, I hate to overload the Martin Luther King Day, but I know it's a day that I'm local. In the afternoon might be a possibility. But then that might be a day off for everyone too, which is deserved. My point in trying to target in there is that we might be able to have seen and at least do searches on filed bills that relate to broadband. I'm sure that the Monadnock region senators are not the sole sources of interest in this topic, and there may be other legislation that we want to follow. And then lining up bills so that our offices can follow up with specific people to make sure that they're notified and can be available.
Thank you for the feedback, Jay. That time frame, roughly 2 months away is in line with that frequency we were thinking of. Are any reactions to that idea of meeting every couple months? This is a great idea. We love it. We want to meet more frequently. We want to meet less frequently. This time needs to be changed. And encourage you to use the chat, but we'll do our best to look for hands raised to unmute you. Okay, well, we'll maybe we can hi, Peggy, did you have your hand raised to comment on this?
I have 2 or 3 times, and I wasn't sure I was hitting the right buttons.
Oh, no, you were. Sorry for not catching you sooner.
That's all right. I suggest that we meet every other month. I think that's more reasonable time if we can find time when everyone is available. I had my hand up earlier because I wanted to tell you that Walpole has in fact received some RFPs. One of the more interesting ones came to us from Austria, but it is primarily a Wi-Fi company, but none of us could go to Austria to interview them. So we aren't considering them, but we have met with Bond Council, and we have also met with the officials from CCI and are going to be looking forward to working a contract with them. So that's where we are today.
Thank you for the feedback on the meetings as well as the update. Okay, I see some positive feedback in the chat on this kind of every other month frequency. And yes, avoiding snowstorms. Although we'd also appreciate any feedback on how this format worked, realizing it's our first attempt at doing a meeting in this format. Super. Are there any other matters folks want to bring up that weren't covered? Okay, well, we're getting close to 4 o'clock here. I don't like to end with this kind of dead silence from the audience, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who participated, to the presenters who made themselves available kind of in a scramble today. And again, our intent is to follow up on the next meeting, agenda, timing, content for the website, obviously before we meet in 2020. So thank you everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Henry. Just bye.